Okay, so it's a pleasure to entertain you, or try to, after lunch, and to try and tell you about the new book, Gastrophysics, that just came out about 6 or 7 weeks ago. And it's all about a new approach, I think, to thinking about food and dining, concentrating on the mind of the diner as much as what goes into their mouth. And kind of gastrophysics is one of those big scientific sounding words, but it's kind of a term that tries to capture the work that we do in Oxford and also around the world with chefs and baristas, cocktail makers, food companies and beyond, looking at sort of nice food experiences. That's the kind of gastronomy side. Here we just have one dish from a chef, Joseph Youssef from Kitchen Theory in High Barnet in London, where he's trying to tempt you through your taste buds, through all of your senses, in fact, to eat differently. This is a pollen and the bee, kind of insect-based dish, and we'll come back to some of his work later. So we're interested in the nice food, the real food experiences, rather than how much fish meal can we feed to the chicken before you can taste it on the breast. I spent too much time with kind of Unilever tasting panels over the year to ever want that on anybody. Every Monday morning for a whole year, frozen Brussels sprouts. Marks out of 10. And the kind of research we do, we don't prepare food, nor are we grow food in any meaningful sense, but we kind of study how people respond and what sort of factors influence what we say about the food and drink that we consume, the choices we make, and the memories we have of the choices we made and the foods that we ate. So that's kind of the psychophysics, the food psychology, if you will. And we study that both in the lab. You can see a subject there, maybe in the Oxford lab, and we're interested in the impact of the shape of the wine glass on the taste and the aroma and the bouquet of the wine therein. You can see how we've isolated all the senses to have a very highly scientifically controlled situation. You can't see the glass, you can't touch the glass, it's moving under your nose, and then we can really isolate the psychology from the chemical differences that glass might have on your perception and responses. Very scientific, highly controlled, just not like the way we really drink wine. So on the flip side, what we also try and do wherever possible is do experiments out there in the wild, in the real world, at food festivals, at science festivals, in restaurants, cafeterias, bars, you name it. If we can collect some data, then we will do. That's kind of noisy environment when people are talking, happy, chatting, distracted, in a party mood. And maybe the last thing they have to think about is the weight of the cutlery in their hand. But if we can show an impact there in the noisy situations of real life, it's not controlled, but it's kind of ecologically valid. And hopefully having these two approaches will help us to get to answer the questions we want and convince the skeptics who come from both sides, it should be said. And the whole approach for gastrophysics is really to reposition the mind as the focus for our experience, enjoyment of food and the choices that we make. And this all comes from, not from us necessarily, but from some of the chefs out there, some of the world famous ones, sometimes some of the best chefs in the world, people like Heston Blumenthal, who wrote the foreword for this book, and who about 15, 20 years ago created a dish that you see here. Here we have one of the world's best chefs who's came to realise that he needed to understand what was going on in the mind of his diners in order to deliver the best taste experiences. And why this dish? Well, it's there to illustrate a point that we always taste first with our eyes. We've evolved to kind of find forage and something else beginning with F, things around us. And in this case, you see that food, and within the blink of an eye, your brain made a prediction. What is that food? Do I like it? Is it good for me? Is it healthy? Would I have to go to the gym if I ate some? And most of us will have thought, it's probably ice cream. I like that. Maybe strawberry. Sweet, yes. And I would have to go to the gym, if not tonight, then tomorrow morning after a scoop or two of that. Automatic, involuntary, within the blink of an eye, our brains predict, make expectations about food. And then when you taste it, even if you taste it at the hands of Heston Blumenthal in his restaurant, The Fat Duck in Bray, he thought it tasted wonderful, this dish. That's why he tried it out on some of his regular consumers. And the consumers, the diners in the restaurant would go, I don't like it. It's salty. It's way too salty. What is the chef thinking? How can he have served that? The chef the best chef in the world thought it tasted perfect. The diners in his restaurant said, no, it's too salty. You kind of lost your touch. Together with Martin Yeomanson from University of Sussex and Heston, they demonstrated with this dish that it's actually a historic ice. It could be smoked salmon or frozen crab bisque ice cream. Both naturally that colour, both things that we might have eaten a century ago, just not today, just not what we expected. But simply if you give a new group of people that dish and say, this is Food 386, change the name, now what do you think of the taste? And simply Food 386. It's a strange name for a dish, is it? Something that Tim Peake might eat up there in outer space? Who knows? But it's enough for you to suspend your expectations. You taste the dish, and it tastes perfectly seasoned to you now. As the chef intended, you like it then, and you're more likely to like it if you experience it thereafter. And it was situations like this that led the chef, and then the psychologist and the gastrophysicist to say that the pleasures of the table are as much, if not more, residing in the mind, not in the mouth. We think we taste in here, and that's where the food goes in. That's where I localize the experience, but that experience is an illusion, because much of our pleasure of food and drink really comes from the nose, and our brain ventriloquizes those sensations into the mouth and tells you, I'm tasting on my tongue. But you're not. You're smelling it. You're also seeing it, feeling it, and in some cases, hearing it too. And all those senses come together for the first time in the brain, and that is where the pleasures reside. Once you realize that, you start to design food experiences very differently from the way you did before. The idea of the palate cleanser of all that kind of acidic sorbet that is meant to cut through something in your tongue, who knows what? Is that really the best way to start a meal? I want a mental palate cleanser instead. And if you want to know what those are, there are a number of examples from some of the world's top chefs in here who are trying to enhance the mood of their diners because they realize that's the single simplest way to enhance the taste of their Michelin-starred food. So it's about the mind, not the mouth. And we work when we can with chefs like Heston Blumenthal and other famous and less famous chefs from around the world trying to apply the latest in brain science, neuroscience, gastrophysics to the work that they do. But sometimes that can seem a bit elitist. I mean, it's nice for me. I get to go and dine at some of these restaurants every few months or so in a way that an Oxford salary would not let you do otherwise. But how does it apply to the rest of us who maybe don't get the chance to go to Bray or to some of those other gastro-tourist hotspots around the world? Well, our hope is through 20 years of working with the food industry and brands big and small, is that the big industry and food industry can be very slow to innovate and to change. You can show the science to the corporate scientists in a food company like Unilever, and they'll sort of create something, and it will embed the science, the latest understanding, but it's like, bleh, it'll kind of dribble all over your chin. And you think, no one's going to want to eat that. By contrast, the top chefs, I think, are brilliant at taking the science and turning it into something delicious, memorable, enjoyable. And they're able to innovate on a very fast timescale. So if you can convince a chef today of something they might want to put on the menu, they will put it on the menu next week or next month. Then you have real diners paying real money for real food. See what works, what doesn't. It might sound bizarre and strange, but it will. The best ideas, I believe, translate down to the mainstream and do so much faster if you start there in the kitchens of the Fat Duck than if you go directly to the healthcare professionals and say you need to change the colour of hospital trays or foods. And one example of how these ideas might translate from the high end to the mainstream is from something like this, thinking about the naming of dishes. Patagonian toothfish. You can sort of imagine yourself reading a menu in some restaurant somewhere. No, maybe I'll have the beef. I don't know. It doesn't really sound too appealing. I can show you the picture of this sustainable but ugly monster of the deep. Now, still, I don't think would help many people to choose this fish rather than something else. But simply by an act of changing the name to Chilean sea bass, exactly the same fish, suddenly, yes, maybe that does sound really rather nice to me. Not just to me, sales of the sustainable fish increased by 1,200% in the UK, in North America, in Australia and beyond, simply by changing the name. The food is the same, but to the extent this is sustainable and good for us, as we've heard, then nudging by naming, you might think of it, could offer some potential. I suspect, for the next time you prepare a meal at home or try and sell some farm product, you're probably not going to get a 1,200% increase in sales simply by naming. This might be the stellar standout case. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of room to play between where we are today and this kind of a gold standard case that might give us reason to think about how we name what we sell, serve, and consume. And that idea then about naming, it's not something you can really taste, but changing the name can change the choices that we make and even change the taste of the food. And there's sort of stories we tell, names we give to foods, descriptions about processes, production methods, preparation, and so on. And a lot of our work, and that of our colleagues in food science, psychology labs around the world, is trying to separate out what can people really tell the difference between in blind taste tests. So here we've got maybe some free-range hens When I was speaking to the International Egg Confederation in Monaco last month, they're very interested in this sort of question about the eggs and whether you can taste a difference from battery farmed to free range. Many people would intuitively say, yes, I can really taste the difference. It's obvious. Certainly there may be a difference in colour, but can you really taste the difference? Then in this research from the States, they found that in fact it is impossible to tell the difference. Get the colours the same, but in a blind taste test, people could not discriminate between battery farmed and free range. And in the words of the author of this piece, which is replicated in many other studies, in fact, if you want your guests to have the best tasting scrambled eggs possible, all you've got to do is tell them that the eggs came from fresh out of your pasture, raised chickens, that morning, add a couple of drops of orange-coloured food colouring before scrambling, and off you go. It will taste better to them, but that's because of what's going on in their mind, the expectations they have, as much as what's going on the taste buds. I think that's really true across, fine wine, that most people cannot tell the difference between cheap and expensive wine, even the experts in a blind wine taste test. The same thing is here for organic, free-range products. Tell people that it's organic, and it will taste better to them, to most people. But in a blind taste test, when you have two foods or more in front of you and you don't know which one is organic, you will not be able to pick it out. So it's all about the labels, the descriptions and the stories as much as the chemical or nutritional properties that may be different due to different farming methods, but might be remarkably difficult to pick up from the taste buds. And here is kind of the best situation when all you're trying to do is tell a difference between two samples of scrambled egg. If you can't do it there, just imagine how much harder it would be to pick up a difference in taste in a noisy restaurant with friends and family and so on. And I don't want to go into all the literature here, but there are many studies out there for the last 3 decades saying whatever nutritional and compositional differences there may be as a function of organic or other types of farming, they turn out to be impossible to detect in the blind taste test. It's more about the mind, the stories you tell, I think, as much as what's in there. And that leads in all sorts of directions, some good, some bad, I guess. It leads and it sort of explains why when you go to the supermarket and try and buy your cheese and lettuce sandwich, you kind of can't just buy a cheese and lettuce sandwich. It's got to be a Wiltshire cured chicken with a Farmer Jim's Oxfordshire rocket. Oh, straight away that sounds much better. Of course, none of us can tell what Farmer Jim's rocket tastes like because I've just made him up. Nevertheless, giving that description to one's ingredients, to one's sandwiches, will make it taste better. Consumers will rate it higher and give more positive comments. Is it about tricking consumers? Sometimes it feels like that. On the other hand, you want to say it's just kind of a total food offering here that incorporates what you see, what you taste, but also what you know about the food. That's the total offering, and you want to optimize that however you can. So give it the descriptive labels, and you will enhance taste right there through the mind, not the mouth. I think the bad side of this has to be, of course, that supermarkets are all too aware of the power of the word, of the description, and maybe when they start creating Rosedene Farm, another farm that does not exist, on their products, they will taste better to consumers. Consumers will pay more for that familiar sounding farm name, but maybe if they read down and find that in fact those strawberries were grown in Morocco, it's kind of clear that Rosedene Farm doesn't really sound like something you'd stumble across in the high Atlas Mountains. It's an entire fabrication, but done thinking about the mind. That seems like trickery, but it is happening, it is with us. So what do we do about it? In our own work, we've kind of gone in a slightly different direction, thinking about the stories we tell about food, and sort of bringing in technology in a way to try and enhance the food experience by connecting what the diner eats at the table to where the food grew, came from, and so on. And the first example of this was with Heston Blumenthal at the Fat Duck, where we tried to use sound to enhance the experience of diners in a dish that's come to be known as the sound of the sea seafood dish that comes to the table: sashimi, seafood, seaweed, sand, and some foam, spume. And on the other hand, the waiter will bring a conch shell with some earbuds, recommend that you put them in. When you do so, you will hear the sounds of the waves, the seagulls flying overhead. and you'll have a different tasting experience. This is a 3 Michelin star restaurant. This is not somebody trying to pull the wool over your eyes. It's the best sourcing possible of that seafood. Nevertheless, the top chefs have realised that if you can tell the stories about their food, it will taste better. And we've done research with Heston and his team at Science Oxford a decade ago to demonstrate that oysters taste better with that kind of soundscape, but no more salty, than if we play modern jazz, restaurant cutlery noises, or farmyard chickens. So the atmospherics matter, and that sort of storytelling through sensory sensploration, if you will. And more chefs are starting to introduce, through technology, a story about the food, the ingredients, to enhance the diner's experience of what is on their plate, if indeed there is one. And this sort of led us on from the sound of the sea that was kind of completely unexpected back in 2007 when we first did the experiment with Heston. People in hindsight have said, oh, it's so obvious. Play the sounds of the sea and seafood tastes better. But I think there's more to it than that. And on that same event in Oxford, we also gave people, 150 members of the public, bacon and egg ice cream that came up from Bray. You had to rate how bacony or eggy the flavour was. And you play the sound of sizzling bacon, and people experience the bacon flavour as more intense. Then you change to the farmyard chickens, and they go, wow, it's changed. It tastes eggier now. Which is better, depends on your taste buds and preferences, but the music up there should change the taste of your food. That is a surprise. That was a lot of fun to do. But people said, okay, I get it with the seaside sounds, but imagine I'm a steak restaurant. Do I... So really, I don't want to be so close to the source of my food. Seafood I don't care about, but cuddly cows, that's a whole different story. So this has got some use, but it's kind of limited, they say. But many of the chefs we work with are very much in this domain of using these sensory cues together with the best of the culinary arts that they've learnt in order to transform, to give people a great time, but also to transform behaviour. But do it through the senses, as much as through telling you it's good for the environment, good for your health. Because those sort of messages, as we heard this morning, don't often work as well as they might. So try and lure people in through their senses. And in this next dish, we have an example of that. A duck dish. So you're in the restaurant in High Barnet, that is your dinner, Picasso on a plate. Maybe it makes you feel uncomfortable, but if it does so, you should think more about where your food comes from. And you need to see this dish using sound and the senses to make you think more. That kind of meaningful thought about your food and what went into making it that many chefs I work with are interested in, and try and do it in this playful but also tasty way. And I should say this duck dish comes in as only one of 9 courses, and it's the only meat dish on the menu. So it's the one time you do get to eat meat, he makes you feel slightly uncomfortable about it, but so be it. So he's trying to change behaviour, kind of one meal, one diner at a time, but I think in an effective manner. Yes. And in case you didn't see who was staring out at you from the plate, it's actually Pablo Picasso. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this dish about kind of the psychology of perception, constructing flavours in a dish as we construct visual impressions on the plate or elsewhere. So we can use technology to kind of draw people closer to the source of their food. That might make it better, but it might also make them squeamish. It might change their behaviour. It might enhance the experience. But we can also do it in a more sort of naturalistic way and take notions from other parts of the world. And Chef Joseph, one of the other dishes he serves is kind of this mushroom dish based on the kind of Japanese notion of sumikaza. Excuse my right pronunciation if it's not quite there. But it's the idea of sort of chefs plating food as they found it when they foraged it in nature. So if you find a mushroom and they're going to serve it to a diner that night, you will plate it just as you found it, nuzzled in amongst the sort of the foam and the rocks and so on, served from a wood platter to kind of emulate nature, and by so doing, elevate that humble sort of fungus to a place it hadn't been before. Again, connecting you to the source of the food, and by so doing, hopefully making a more memorable, but also a more enjoyable experience as a result. And maybe changing your behaviour along the way. And this sort of connection between sort of the food that we eat and where it came from can be brought a little bit closer. One sees a number of chefs out there, some very successful ones, like Dan Barber here from Blue Hill in New England, sort of having the farm right next to the restaurant. There are others in the UK one could mention, having much the same approach. And I think by bringing the source of some of the ingredients right to the doorstep, that does change the experience. We'll say those vegetables do taste better if we can see their source and imagine they were picked that morning from just outside. We know exactly the food distance that is involved. I think this is as much about psychology in a blind taste test. Could you tell it was picked this morning from just outside? I'm betting not. But your belief that it was is the key to enhancing the experience. And what Dan Barber's doing sort of in a high-end food scenario, I also wonder whether it's sort of happening a bit with sort of vertical farming, hydroponics. I see a number of chefs now playing a little bit in this space with some of your dinner growing on the walls, maybe of the restaurant. And yeah, maybe it's just the herbs are growing just by your table, and you'll be encouraged to go and pick them yourselves prior to eating the dish. And in that act of picking your own, it's kind of a weaker version, but I think it still enhances the experience. A weaker version of I grew it myself probably makes things, as we heard before, taste better. Or I made the dish myself makes things taste better. That's the IKEA effect. Everyone who makes IKEA furniture thinks it's wonderful. No one else does. It's because they made it themselves, and by making it themselves, it does taste better. And there's research from Norway, from one of the business schools, showing that if you take a part-prepared meal and let people finish it off, then if you think you made that dish, it tastes better to you. Whereas if you think somebody else made it, or it was fully prepared, it doesn't. Exactly the same food, but your belief or your engagement in the act of creation, preparation, presentation is part of the total experience. And the intuitive, creative chefs, restaurateurs are taking that on board and trying to integrate it into their offering through technology or not. And of course, not just the star chefs are doing it. One can think of sort of the apps like this one from McDonald's in Australia that allow the consumers to trace the path from cow to burger, that will give them the information and maybe enhance the experience, an experiment for the gastrophysicist waiting to be done. But technology being brought to change the way we view, interact with, or what we know about food. And again, in our own work, we're sort of saying, well, this great technology we all have in our pockets, the mobile phones, the tablets and so on, how can that be repositioned to enhance our food experiences moving forward? Because tablets and mobile devices are some of the best and most amazing technology out there, but it's kind of separate from our food. It's distracting us from our food as we eat in front of the TV or as we take gastroporn images of our restaurant meals out. Can we reposition that technology to tell stories about the food, to enhance the experience? So could we start at home, serving the sound of the sea for one of those tablets? Many chefs, 2 or 3 Michelin star chefs are starting to play here, taking the tablet as a plate. And then what? What stories do you tell to enhance the diner's experience? Starts high end, but I'm sure that some of those chain restaurants will be plating off tablets before we realise it. Okay, one step further, the technology we don't yet have in the home, but is out there, kind of this augmented or virtual reality headsets. There are some startups in Silicon Valley and elsewhere with headsets that allow you to really experience what it might be like to eat cheesecake on Mars. Not sure I want to go there myself, all the dirt and the grit and the lack of atmosphere, but nevertheless they can project images of Mars or of the farm where your burger came from. It's technology and food mashed up, starting at the high end, but many big brands are thinking, how can we utilise this technology to change the offering that we deliver? I want to say that beyond the sight of the food, very simple, the colour of their ice cream to begin with, setting expectations in your mind. Of course, the top chefs don't just use one colour, they use palettes of colours, and you can use the psychology, the understanding that the first taste is with the eye to actually change behaviour and enhance food. This example from a Charles Michel, a Franco-Colombian chef, who got very frustrated that back home in Colombia, which has one border on the Amazon, none of his fellow countrymen and women liked Colombian food. They all wanted French and Italian, and yet they have millions or hundreds of thousands of tens of thousands of amazing ingredients there, but no one wanted to eat them. And this is his attempt to take his French Bocuse training and take his native ingredients and transform them into something that their fellow Colombians have not been seen before. Kandinsky on a canvas, a 31-element salad, where those vegetables from his homeland now become paints to paint the canvas. It's a very different food experience. It does set expectations that translate into added value, both in the lab when we test it there, but also in cafeterias and restaurants like this one, where we had 160 diners for a single service lunch. 80 got the plating on the left, 80 got the plating on the right, and you can see the difference in the willingness to pay for exactly the same food. And now there are kind of online and other techniques to show what is the best way to present your food on the plate, but also on the package, in order to enhance the consumer response and maybe nudge people in the right direction, given that salad is something that's kind of good for many of us. That's all of the work we do, working with chefs. We can't make the food, but we can help them to optimize the design on the plate, or for food companies, the image of the food on or through the packaging. Making it more appealing, mostly. But I suppose I have to recognize that kind of counter trend here towards the wonky fruit that seems to be emerging as the growing concern about how much of the deformed or dwarfed or just odd-looking fruit is thrown away. And that seems to be gaining some traction here in the marketplace. All good, appealing to the ugly in food, but kind of as myself, as a son of a greengrocer in Horsforth, Leeds, back in the 1970s, the joke between me and my brother and sister was that we never realised that bananas came in any other colour than this, because all we ever got to eat was the stuff that the customers hadn't bought by the end of the week. So it's quite a revelation going to university and finding out, wow, they really come in yellow. But of course, this makes a much better banana cake. The real flavour is in the older, the uglier fruit. And there's kind of a trade-off there between beautiful for the eye, beautiful in terms of flavour delivery. That's kind of interesting to study. So just to finish off, I want to think of a couple of examples of the future, shifting behaviour in the longer term. And we see some artists in this space thinking about food blights, effects of food, global warming. This from a food truck that went around Philadelphia a couple of years ago, thinking if global warming takes place, then maybe we'll have no more chocolate, no more cod, no more peanuts. What will that world be like? Do we really want to be there? It sounds abstract and far away, but you could go and experience the future with this tube in your nose, eating some kind of indescribable chewy mush as the smell of peanut was synthetically recreated, pumped into your nose. It's kind of a food experience, not one you necessarily want, but one which, having experienced it, might change your behaviour, maybe, who knows. The other sort of solution here, again, is a high-tech one. This is from my colleague Katsuo Okajima in Japan, using a headset you can use to watch movies at home. When the seas have been fished to extinction of some of our favourite fish, maybe it'll be the augmented version that we have. And you can see here the sushi on the left, the original sushi, and the sushi on the right is a virtual fish superimposed over the sushi. And notice how we've got here the perfect veining, the perfect texture, the sheen of the fish, very hard to represent. And that's all done without QR codes, without other labels or tracking devices, in real time. You can bite into that sushi. Is that a depressing future? Maybe, but how technology might help going ahead. And maybe more of us will be having these augmented and virtual food experiences as some of our present-day foods don't have. And finally, insects, entomophagy. That's kind of one way to a more sustainable food future, as coming out of this United Nations report. Some claiming even, the Martin at the bottom, but melodramatically, that eating insects might be the last great hope to save the planet. This is sustainable, proteinaceous, good for you, good for the planet, good for everything. It's just that whenever we think about that as part of our food future, it's like, no way, that's disgusting, I'm never going to do that. Why so? Partly because of the way the insects are portrayed in the media. It's kind of fun to have the A to Z list celebrities eating them and being disgusted. But I think we need to work on this, and gastrophysics, that's kind of one of the biggest challenges. If you know something about the mind of the consumer, what makes them taste food the way it does, we can make nice food nicer, but how to make the really disgusting stuff into something edible that we crave, that's the challenge. And there are a couple of solutions here I'll just end on. One is these, super colonas. You can see them on the screen, big-assed, Amazonian flying ants. Well, they flew once. I've got some, if anyone wants some later. Proteinaceous, good for you, good for the planet, sustainable. Colombians love them. They'll eat this insect, but no other. offer my wife, locusts and baby bee brood and all sorts. No way. But these she craves. And I was just at a conference at the Colombian embassy last night, and the audience, when they saw I had this season's supply, they kind of come up to the stage and ate half of them. They couldn't resist this tasty treat. So we have different views on insects, and how can we nudge people through naming, through understanding cultural differences in the appreciation of insects. And I'll just leave you with the two strategies we're working on together with the Nordic Food Lab and Ben Reed. One is kind of health by stealth, taking foods like peanut butter, that can already have as many as 30 insect parts in every 100-gram jar. So we're all eating insects already. So maybe next year we make it 35 insect parts, and then 40 the year after, and 100 by 2020. And without any of us realising it, we've kind of got those insects as part of the diet without anyone realising. In the same way that salt has been reduced in cereals over the decades, gradually health by stealth is the way to do it. That time, is it? And the final one, came back to Chef Joseph Youssef, and here a dish. It's kind of combining it all. It's an offering to the gods from his Mexican pop-up dining concept. That has venison as the only dish on the 9-course tasting menu. He's trying to change your behaviour. That one dish comes preceded by the venison dance from the Mexican state opera to make you think about the animal being killed. But it's also got a little dusting of insects down there, the brown stuff at the bottom, kind of surreptitiously placed. You don't have to eat them. It's kind of a seasoning that might enhance the dish. He's doing it through your mind as much as through your mouth. But I think this sensory approach to changing behaviour is one we're excited by. And we have the chefs on board, some of them at least, and food companies are starting to follow up, saying some of the innovations that start in the high end are percolating down and they want to be part of the emerging story. Thank you.